Please subscribe our channel for future videos.
There's a new Pentagon press pool. The new corps is made up of groups and individuals who agreed to a new press policy put in place by the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. Nearly all long-standing news outlets, including CNN, rejected the very restrictive policy and turned in their press passes. I want to bring in CNN's chief media analyst, Brian Stelter, and former CNN Pentagon correspondent, our good friend Barbara Starr. Brian, let me start with you. Take us through the outlets who now have access to the Pentagon.
Yeah, this is all about publicity, Wolf, as opposed to real journalism. As you see, the Pentagon's press office trying to bring in MAGA media influencers in a apparent bid to replace the journalists that had been at the Pentagon before. But of course, those journalists from CNN, the New York Times, and AP and Reuters, and dozens of other outlets, they are still on the job, still covering the Pentagon just from outside the building's 5 walls. Some of the new outlets, some of the MAGA media outlets that have been invited in by Pete Hegseth and his aides include Gateway Pundit, National Pulse, Just the News, Frontlines, and Lindell TV. That's a streaming service from the MyPillow CEO, Mike Lindell. When you dig a little deeper into these outlets, you see they are almost entirely right-wing, but more importantly, they're better known for commentary than straight news reporting. They're best known for their pro-Trump talking points and not actually for investigative reporting. And some of the outlets acknowledge that up front, that they exist to be partisan media outlets supporting the president. Gateway Pundit, for example, has faced defamation lawsuits involving 2020 election lies. There are still appeals underway. Lindell TV, that's Mike Lindell's channel. You know, he has been in court for years over those 2020 election lies. So these are outlets that advance the president's agenda. They do not specialize in investigative reporting or digging, but it is notable the Pentagon trying to bring in these influencers in a kind of a PR stunt of sorts to say, hey, we're going to bring in our new voices to the Pentagon.
Good point. Barbara Starr, you and I are old friends, colleagues. We covered the Pentagon together when I was the Pentagon correspondent and moved over to cover the White House. You replaced me, did an amazing job. How do you see these right-wing outlets who are now part of the press corps at the Pentagon that both of us used to cover on a day-to-day basis, me during the first Gulf War? What's your reaction when you see what's going on?
Well, first of all, I just absolutely reject the Pentagon's assertion that there is a new Pentagon press corps that they have announced. That's not how the world works in this country with a free press. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of journalists that continue to cover the Pentagon who did not sign up to the new restrictive rules, who are continuing to do their jobs every day. The Pentagon's gone so far as to say these journalists, the traditional journalists, self-deported from the Pentagon. How ridiculous is that? Deportation is a message point, and it indicates criminal behavior. That is not what is going on here. So reporters are continuing to report, and they're breaking scoops every single day from outside the Pentagon.
After limiting press access to the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is now cracking down on communication between the military and members of Congress. A new 5-page memo obtained by NBC News and confirmed by a defense official instructs DoD personnel to obtain approval before talking to people on Capitol Hill in order to, quote, ensure consistency and support for the department's priorities. The memo warns that unauthorized engagements with Congress may undermine department-wide priorities. Let's bring in MSNBC Pentagon correspondent Priya Sridhar. Brendan Buck served as press secretary to former House Speaker John Boehner. So, Priya, tell us more about this new policy.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. Well, this policy applies to any Department of Defense personnel, and it essentially says that you are no longer allowed to communicate with anybody on Capitol Hill unless you have that communication go through the Office of Legislative Affairs. And that includes anything from meeting congressional reporting requirements to requests for information to even technical assistance. And this is a dramatic departure from the way things have worked worked in the past, where typically every single service branch, whether that was the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force, actually had their own Office of Legislative Affairs that could speak directly to members of the Armed Services Committee or anyone, frankly, that they wanted to on Capitol Hill to make recommendations or lobby for priorities that were specific to their services. Now, Breaking Defense was the first publication to obtain this memo and essentially publish about it. And they asked for some sort of clarification or background from Chief Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell. And he said that this is necessary to improve accuracy and responsiveness in communicating with Congress to facilitate increased transparency. But of course, many critics of this policy say, listen, this is very similar to the policies we've seen where Hegseth has tried to clamp down on the flow of information, whether that's to the Pentagon press corps or even with things like polygraphs within the Department of Defense to try to stop leaks, Chris.
Priya Sridhar, thank you. Okay, Brendan, you know the Hill. What impact could this have, both on the ability of the military and Congress to do their jobs?
Yeah, there's an important relationship between Congress and the administration, and particularly DOD, where they have a lot of complicated things going on. I'd be very surprised if this ends up holding up or flying. Look, Congress has not really stood up for itself a lot over the last few years. But the Armed Services Committee is actually the one committee in Congress that does its job every year, passes an authorization. And to do that, it relies on a lot of ongoing conversations with military leaders about what their priorities are, what's working, what the threats are. And so this is going to be very difficult for them to get, I think, the level of detail. Priya talked about the technical assistance. Those things are really important. Look, I have no problem if the secretary wants to have a more organized system. I think probably something they're getting at is, do you want the head of the Navy coming in and saying, this is the most important thing, when the head of the Army is saying, well, no, actually spend your money on this? You probably do want to have some sort of organized system for that. But I just wonder if they're biting off a lot more than they can chew here, and they're going to get a lot of blowback.
Well, yeah, and that's my key question, though. Do you think Speaker Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Thune will see this as a line that they can't allow the White House to cross?
If it was any other area of the government, I think they'd probably get away with this. But I do think the leaders of the Armed Services Committee on a bipartisan basis are just going to simply demand the type of responsiveness and the type of candor that they're used to getting. Again, most of the government runs on old statutes. The Congress passed a law long ago. They never updated it, and that allows the administration to just kind of do whatever it wants. That's very different with the Defense Department. Every year, the Armed Services Committee enacts, and it has for 40 or 50 years, it acts what we call the National Defense Authorization Act. And that gets really under the hood and dictates what the priorities are, what programs we're going to focus on, what we're going to invest in, things that really matter to a lot of those people in that building at the Pentagon. And if they're not getting the answers that they want, if they're not getting the candor that they want, I think they're going to make some noise about it. And it's going to have a bad effect for Hegseth, his own priorities. So it would not surprise me if this does lead to some conflict. Look, maybe they think they can run all of this through a central legislative affairs operation, and if they can get what they need done through that, this actually isn't a problem. But the scale of the type of things that go on at Pentagon and the level of detail that the authorizing committees in Congress get into is overwhelming, and I really question whether they'll be able to meet the task, and we could have a blow up if they don't.
Let me ask you about another story in the last minute that we have, since you were at one point a press secretary. This is the exchange between White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and a correspondent from Huffington Post, which has gone viral after Leavitt actually posted a screenshot of their text messages. The reporter questioned Leavitt about a location for a possible Trump-Putin summit, and she asked, who suggested Budapest? Leavitt replies, your mom did. The reporter asks, is this funny to you? Leavitt writes, it's funny to me that you actually consider yourself a journalist. You are a far-left hack who nobody takes seriously. And she finishes by writing, stop texting me your disingenuous, biased, and BS questions.
There's a dangerous shift taking place in Washington, one that strikes at the very heart of America's democracy. The Pentagon, once the most closely observed defense institution in the world, has now introduced a restrictive new press policy that shuts the door on long-standing, credible outlets, CNN, The New York Times, Reuters, and others. These are not just names, they are institutions that have held power to account for decades. Their refusal to sign the new rules is not defiance, it's a defense of journalism itself. In their place, the Pentagon is welcoming a new kind of media. Politically loyal influencers and hyper-partisan platforms like Gateway Pundit and Lindell TV. These outlets are not known for investigation or fact-checking, they're known for echoing political talking points. What we're seeing here is not inclusion, it's infiltration. The goal isn't transparency, it's control of the narrative, but the problem runs deeper. A new internal memo now restricts communication between the Pentagon and Congress, demanding all contacts go through one central office. In simple terms, the Defense Department now decides what information Congress is allowed to see. That's not just bureaucracy, that's a barrier to democratic oversight. When power begins to manage information instead of allowing it to flow freely, democracy starts to suffocate quietly. These policies might create short-term political comfort, but in the long run, they erode public trust and weaken the credibility of the very institutions they aim to protect. True strength of a nation does not lie in silencing critics. It lies in tolerating scrutiny. And when journalists are forced outside the walls of the Pentagon to report the truth, that truth will still find its way to the people, often louder, sharper, and far more damaging. This isn't just a media story. It's a test of how much control Americans are willing to surrender, and how much truth they're willing to fight for.